Well, it's hard to admit this to you, but before my wife and I, before we moved our family to College Station, we actually lived in Waco, and I led a ministry there called Vertical, which was modeled after Breakaway. And so we'd meet on Baylor's campus every Monday night at 9 p.m., and hundreds of Baylor Bears would gather together, and I would teach the word. And it was a really good thing, and I loved my time there ministering to Baylor students, and then I was so thankful that God called me to come back to Texas A&M University. But when I was in Waco, serving as the director of Vertical, when I was in Waco, I would go and work at Baylor's library often. The reason I would do that is because on the third floor of the library were all of the books for the seminary students that went to Baylor's seminary. And so any book that I could want or need when studying to prepare sermons, it was on that third floor. And so I always loved going to study and work at the library. And so I will never forget this one time. I went up to the third floor of the library, and it was packed because it was exam time. And I liked going to the library because on Monday nights I would speak to a lot of students, and so when I go to the library, I kind of felt pretty cool. I felt like, I was like, you know what, I'm the vertical guy. People are going to like seeing me, so I'm going to take the long way to my seat, just so people can see me. If they want to congratulate me for something, they probably can. If they want to smile, give me a head nod or maybe a pound out, whatever they want to do, or just stop me and say, you know what, you changed my life. Like, that's a great thing. So I'm going to take the long way around to my seat. And so that's what I did on this particular day that I went to work at the library. I started on the left side and I walked the entire floor because the place was packed. It was hard to find a seat. It was exam time. So there were students everywhere. And I finally got to my seat and I sat down so disappointed because on my walk to my seat, I probably passed by 100 students and no one even looked up at me. No one said a thing to me. No one even acknowledged me. I was so disappointed. I was so shocked. And then as I sat there in my seat, something else just rattled me because when I looked down on my right, there was a piece of toilet paper that was on the side of the chair. And I began to trace the toilet paper to the source of origin, and I found that it was originating from the back of my pants. And I just began to process what was happening in that moment. And I'm just going to let you in. This is probably oversharing, but I'm a germ freak. So when I use a public toilet, for certain purposes, I put toilet paper down on the seats. That's the kind of guy that I am. And apparently on this particular day, I tore off too much toilet paper, so there was too much hanging off on the front end. So when I pulled my pants back up, about this much toilet paper stuck in the back of my pants, and about this much toilet paper went for a ride around the third floor of Baylor's library. And in that moment, who I thought I was and who I actually was collided. Like, I went to the library that day thinking that I was the cool vertical guy. In actuality, I was just the creepy old dude that apparently didn't know how to take care of business correctly. And it was just this horrifying and humbling moment. And as I look back on that moment, the thought that I have, the thought that I think is like, that's not who I wanted to be in that position. Like, that's not who I wanted to be. That is not who I wanted to be in that position. Who I thought I was and who I actually was were polar opposites. And the reason I tell you that is because we've been in this series, journeying through the life of David. We're talking about leadership, and what we've identified since 9-1 is the majority of you in here consider yourself leaders, and the majority of you will find yourself in official positions of leadership with significant responsibility. Here's what I want to do tonight. I want to make sure that who you think you are as a leader and who you actually are as a leader are not at odds with one another. I want to guard you against who you think you are and who you actually are being at odds. Like, I want to guard you against thinking that you're a good leader when you're actually a difficult leader. And I want to guard you from one day looking back on your time at A&M, looking at the leadership positions that you've filled. I want to guard you from looking back and thinking, that's not who I wanted to be in that position. And so tonight we're talking about the position. I don't know what it is for you. Some of you right now, you're in the position. Like you're in the most significant leadership position right now that you will have during your time at A&M. That's where some of you are right now. Others of you are not there yet, but you're actually applying for it now. Like you're going through the application process as we speak, and you will be in the position, the most significant leadership position you will have during your time at A&M. You will be in it next fall. And then some of you, maybe you're freshmen and you're like, I don't know where I'm going to be over the next 3, 4, 5 years that I'm here around Aggieland. But at some point, you just know, and you have a sense, you know what, at some point I'm going to land somewhere in some student organization, and I'm going to provide leadership in some capacity. I want to talk about the position. And I want to talk about helping you maximize your moment in that position. So if you have a Bible, I want you to join me back in the life of David by turning with me to 2 Samuel chapter 5. 2 Samuel chapter 5 is where we're going to be. If you have been journeying with us through David's life, this is kind of the moment we've been waiting for. Like we're finally going to see David become king. If you know the story, if you've been here most weeks, then you know David was anointed king at the age of 15, just hitting puberty, and he finds out he's going to rule a nation. But that actually doesn't come to fruition until he's 30 years old. The in-between stage, those 15 years, he was on the run for the majority of the time, running for his life because the outgoing king, Saul, was trying to take him out. Even when he hit 30, he wasn't stepping into the position that was promised him when he was 15. Like there was so much drama around David actually becoming king over the entire nation of Israel, because even when Saul, the outgoing king, when he died, some other guy, one of Saul's sons, got thrust into the position of king. And so he became king over a certain kind of section of the kingdom of Israel. And then David became king of a smaller section known as Judah. And so even at the age of 30, David's been waiting for 15 years to become king of the entire nation. And even then, he has to spend 7.5 years ruling over this small portion of the kingdom of Israel. And then finally, in 2 Samuel chapter 5, he is anointed king over the entire nation. We're going to look at his life, and as we do, I'm going to give you 6 truths from his life that will help you maximize your moment in the position. 6 points sounds like a lot. We're going to move through them quickly. I hope you're taking notes. Don't assume that God's not going to say something that you don't need to write down tonight. Okay? So here we go, 2 Samuel chapter 5. Let me just read you verses 1 through 5, and we'll get to see David being anointed for the position that was promised back when he was 15. It says this, "Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, 'Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led us out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel.' So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. So just to see what's going on here, like it's kind of like this. Okay, David is king over this small portion of the kingdom of Israel. And it's like the rest of the kingdom of Israel decided to go to UT. Or TU. It's like they decided to go there, and then after 7.5 years, they're going nowhere at TU. And they're like, we're gonna transfer, and we're gonna go where God wanted us to go in the first place, which was to A&M, if anyone from TU is watching right now. you should still come to A&M. There's still time for you. Anyway, God loves you. But and so they transfer. And they're where God wanted them to be, at Texas A&M University, with David ruling over the entire nation. So that's what's going on here. The first truth you need to know if you want to maximize your moment in the position of leadership is this: lead on your way to the position. Like, lead on your way to the position. Look back at what it says in verse 2. What does it say? In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you, David, who led out and brought in Israel. What are they saying? They're saying, David, you've been leading long before you were king. I love this about David. David didn't wait for the position to start leading. David led wherever he was. Like, we see that from the beginning. Back in 1 Samuel chapter 16, when he was anointed king at 15, what did he do after he was anointed? He went right back to the fields to lead his father's sheep. Chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, Saul and all of the army of Israel, they go to battle with the Philistines and a giant named Goliath. And what did they do? They tremble in fear. So David shows up and he leads in faith. 1 Samuel chapter 18, Saul the king makes David a commander over a portion of his army. And so what does David do? He goes out and he takes people out. He gets the job done. And then when David goes on the run from King Saul, even then when he was on the run, listen to what it says about him. In 1 Samuel 22, it says, and when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him, and everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in doubt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him, and he became commander over them. And there were with him about 400 men. Do you see it? Even when he was on the run, he was leading. David led where he was. Lead wherever you are. Like, you don't have to wait for a position to be a leader. You can lead today in your dorm or your apartment or at your church or in your student organization or on your, rec sports team. Like, you can lead now. Like, let's be clear. It's not a position that makes someone a leader. It's followers that make someone a leader. Do you understand what I'm saying? It is not a position that makes someone a leader. There are plenty of people in positions of leadership who are not leading in those positions of leadership. A position doesn't make you a leader. Followers make you a leader. I went to seminary at Dallas Theological Seminary, and famous professor Howard Hendricks, I was taking his class, and I'll never forget him saying, if you think you're a leader, just turn around and see who's following you. Because if no one's following you, you're not a leader. You're not leading anyone. Followers make you a leader. Some of you, you can lead now, and people are ready to follow you now. Lead wherever God has you. I remember one of my best friends in college. We were in the same fraternity. We joined a Greek fraternity. It was an opportunity for me to get around guys I wouldn't normally get around, and it was an opportunity for me to minister to guys and share Jesus with guys that didn't know Jesus. And one of my best friends, John, ran for secretary of our fraternity, and he got it. So basically, the position of secretary in this fraternity was basically a glorified note taker. His job was to take notes at our chapter meetings and during the EC or executive council meetings. That was his job. It was to take notes. I texted him about this yesterday. I was like, hey man, you did a lot more than just be secretary. Tell me everything that you did for the fraternity when you were secretary. And he was like, well, blasphemer past, because it's been a minute. But this is a guy who led where he was. He didn't wait for the position of president to lead. So here's what he wrote back. He said he dove into recruiting and donations from alumni and alumni communications. He dove into a new website and new marketing, and he thought about how we position ourselves on campus. He thought about our brand and design with t-shirts and invites. He leaned into our philanthropy and risk management. He took cried in our fraternity house. Like our friends gave him a hard time because they found him with like a dust mitt on his hands and knees, dusting the floorboards. Why? Because he wanted our house to be a place that we could be proud of people coming over. He cared about how we partnered with sororities, and then he documented everything so that the next group of leaders had a playbook for how to do what we did. You see it? Like he didn't wait to become president. He actually became president the next year. It made sense. But he didn't wait for the position to lead. He led right where God had him. I think about my time in that fraternity. I wanted to be chaplain in this fraternity because I really wanted to lead a Bible study with the guys. And so I ran for chaplain and I didn't get it. This other guy jumped up and ran for chaplain at the last minute and got it. It was so like deflating. This guy wasn't walking with the Lord, and he wanted to be chaplain just because he wanted to be over the rituals of our fraternity. And so I was so disappointed that I didn't get it because I felt like I needed the position to lead. And then I realized like I don't have to have the position to lead. I can lead right where God has me. And so I led a Bible study with guys. I called every guy in the chapter every week and invited them to a Bible study. And so I had opportunities that whole year that I lived in the house to share Jesus with the different guys in the fraternity. You can lead right where you are. I just want to encourage you to lead on your way to the position. Don't wait for a position to lead. Best thing you can do is take a minute and just think about the spheres of influence that God has placed you in. A sphere of influence is a specific group of people that you are around on a regular basis. So each of your classes is a sphere of influence. If you work out at the same time, the same day each week, that's a sphere of influence. If you're in a student organization, that is a sphere of influence. Now answer this question. How can you help that organization or that group of people flourish? And get to work. Lead on your way to the position. Second point, if you want to maximize your moment, is this: be patient for the position. Like, be patient for the position. Look back at verses 4 and 5. What does it say? David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And at Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. Like, if you've been with us every week of the semester, you probably feel the frustration. Like, how could you wait that long to lead David? But what I love is that David never clawed for the throne. Like, we never find David complaining, like, you know what, I could be such a better leader than Saul. Like, I can do this so much better. It's not fair. There's no whining. He's patient as he waits for the position. Some of you guys right now, you're not resonating with this point yet because you get everything you apply to. And so if you apply to something, you get it. Like all your friends, they look to you naturally as the leader. Someday you're going to be on the 30 under 30 influencers list, and good for you. Congratulations. But you know where you're going to struggle? You're going to struggle. You're always going to get the position, but when you're in that position, you're going to want a better position. And it's not going to happen fast enough. Life isn't going to progress fast enough for you. You're always going to be looking ahead of you, just saying, you know, I'm ready for that position. I'm ready for more leadership and more responsibility. But then others of you in here, like, you know what it's like to apply for something and not get it. Just like for me, when I applied to be chaplain or ran for chaplain, didn't get it. You know what that feels like. Like, you want to be in a position of leadership and you applied for it and you didn't get it and you're disappointed in that. Let me just encourage you, don't despair. Don't sit in your disappointment. Don't rail against the person who did get the position and say, yeah, I could do it so much better than she could, or I can do it so much better than he can. Like, let me just encourage you, sometimes God has to do a work in you so that he can do a greater work through you. Let me just say that again. Sometimes God needs to do a work in you so that he can do a greater work through you. So no matter which person you are in here, let me just encourage you to change the question that you're asking God. Some of you are asking the question, God, what am I supposed to do? Like, God, what do you want me to do? Instead of asking God that question, God, what do you want me to do? Change the question to this. God, what do you want to do in me? Because you haven't moved me to that position yet, because I haven't gotten a position of leadership yet, God, what do you want to do in me? I was so encouraged. One of you came up to me after Breakaway one time this semester. And I loved it because this guy came up to me. He was telling me that he had applied for a position of leadership. He didn't get it. And so he was just talking to me about one aspect of his life. And he was just saying, hey, help me think through this. How should I think through this? Because he felt like this aspect of his life might have impacted him getting the position or not getting the position. And what I loved about that is that he was itching to grow. He wasn't just going to sit in disappointment. He wanted to grow. So he's like, you know what? I want God to do a work in my life. That's what I saw in him. I was so encouraged by that. Like, those are the students. I'm like, I want to run with those type of people, those types of students who, even when they don't get the position, they're like, well, God, what do you want to do in me? So that one day you can do something greater through me. The third point is this: position brings opposition. You just need to know that. Position brings opposition. Look at verse 6. It says this, and the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, you will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off, thinking David cannot come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David. And David said on that day, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul. Therefore, it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built the city all around from the Milo inward. Okay, all eyes on me. Let me make sure you understand what's going on here. Because there was talk about David hating the blind and the lame, and that feels really weird and wrong. So let me make sure you understand what's going on here. This is David's first act as king. His first act is to establish a new capital city. David has been living, the capital for him of Judah has been Hebron, and so he is going to make a new capital, and he chooses Jerusalem, which is a city that's actually outside of Judah. So this is a smart move for David, because what he's trying to do now that he's the king over all of Israel is he's trying to unify the country. So he picks a city that is a non-Judah city. And it's going to garner trust with the people who live in the areas that are not Judah. The problem is living in Jerusalem are the Jebusites. The Jebusites referred to Judah as Jebus, which was basically the pre-Israelite name for Jerusalem. And the Jebusites were sworn enemies of Israel. They were a people who God told the Israelites back in the book of Joshua, when they first came into the land of Canaan, God told them to remove the Jebusites from the land. But Israel failed to do it. They couldn't do it. And so that's playing in the background when the Jebusites hear that Israel's going to come against them. What's their message to David? Their message is, the weakest among us, the blind and the lame, the weakest among us will take out the strongest among you. That's their message. When they talk about the blind and the lame, that's what they're saying. The weakest among us will crush the strongest among you. So when it says that David is going to go against them and he hates them, what he's doing is David is saying he's against the entire nation or the entire group of the Jebusites. But listen to what the message was. Listen to the opposition. What's the opposition? You will fail. You are not enough. That's the opposition coming towards David. And you just need to know, anytime you're going to step into a significant position of leadership, those same things will be spoken into your life. It'll either come from the outside or from within. You will hear from either someone or from yourself, I will fail. and I'm not enough. Like, I've experienced that in my own life. Like, my first full-time job, I was a student pastor in Austin. And I will never forget sitting at a coffee shop with one of our volunteers. And you know what he told me? He just looked at me and said, I just do not like how you do things. And then when I was in Waco at Vertical, I was a college student, was trying to tell me how I should lead the ministry. And what his point was basically like, I do not like how you do things. And then when I came to Breakaway, during my first year, you know what I was told? Hey, Breakaway's just not that cool anymore. And we get trolled all the time. I mean, people say horrific things about Breakaway on social media. I remember reading one person's post that says, I am proud of the fact that I've never been to Breakaway. Like, that's one of the gentler things that is said about us, is the opposition. My friend Chris Kuba, he likes to say, leaders do hard things. And that one phrase has rattled around in my mind for the last year and a half, and it has gotten me through several key moments of leadership. You know what? Leaders do hard things. And one of the hard things that leaders do is they move forward in the midst of opposition. They are not deterred from their point and purpose, what God has called them to do. And that's what David shows us. He moves forward courageously. And I love what the text says. What does the text say? It says, verse 7, key word, nevertheless. Nevertheless. Even in the midst of opposition, nevertheless. You just need to know, nevertheless will need to find its way into your story if you're going to be a leader. Like, if you have thin skin, it is hard to lead when you have thin skin. Like, I am on a lifelong process of thickening my skin. Like, if you're a people pleaser and you need everyone to love you and you need everyone to like everything that you do, you will have a very difficult time as a leader. Leaders do hard things. Position brings opposition. So let me just encourage you. Good leaders are able to move forward even in the midst of opposition. Now, let me just say this. If you're running an organization right now and you are running that organization into the ground and everyone is dropping out and no one wants to be around you, you probably shouldn't just assume, like, this is just opposition, like I'm just moving forward. Well, you might need to step back and evaluate if there's some blind spots to your leadership. Don't be like TA told me, like, I'm just powering through. If everyone quits, that's your problem. But this is just opposition. I'm hanging with Jesus. Like, don't put that on Jesus when Jesus is like, you're the problem. Like, that's just a side note, but I'm just saying. But for the majority of you here, you just need to know, like, if God has called you to be somewhere and to do something, you better not go somewhere else and do something else until God tells you to go somewhere else and do something else. Until God tells you to move in a different direction, man, you stay the course. You stay the course. And you let the word nevertheless find its way into your story of leadership. Next point is this: your position doesn't make you great, God does. Your position doesn't make you great, God does. Look at what it says in verse 10. And David became greater and greater for, put a box, if you mark up your Bible, put a box around the word for. For the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. That word for, if you learn Bible study methods, that word for is considered a connecting word because it connects two things. It connects the reality that David was becoming greater and greater with the reason he's becoming greater and greater. So that word for, it means because, like we're getting an explanation here. The text tells us why David is becoming greater and greater. Why is he becoming greater and greater? For the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. When it refers to God as the God of hosts, what that is talking about is the fact that God is the commander of armies of angels and armies of human beings. What that is saying is that God has limitless resources, and God is unleashing his limitless resources. He's the God of hosts. He's unleashing them into David's life. David's life is marked by the presence and the provision of God. That is why he's becoming greater and greater. So let's just be clear. A position does not make you great. And I just want you to hear that, because positions can turn college students into tools. Like, sometimes people just become so weird when they get big positions. They just become difficult to be around. And so let me just encourage you, do not become a tool. Write that down, highlight it. Don't become a tool. Your position doesn't make you great. God does. Let me just give you a few things to beware of, okay? Don't miss these. Number one, beware of the day you stop praying for God's provision in your leadership. Like, beware of the time when you've gone 2, 3, 4, 5 days without asking God's presence and provision in your leadership. You know what that's a sign of? It's a sign that you're growing comfortable not needing God. That's a really dangerous place to be, because you have an inflated view of self and a deflated view of God. Beware of the days that you're too important for certain tasks. Like, if certain tasks are below you, you're no longer fit to lead. There's Tuesday nights where I will still walk around, and if I see trash, I'll pick it up just to remind myself, you're not above that. Like, just because I stand on this stage does not mean that I am above picking up trash that we leave. Beware of the day that you begin to believe that God needs you more than he needs other people. Like, when you start believing that God's kingdom will not make it without you, and he needs you a lot more than he needs that girl or that guy. Just beware of that day. Beware of the day that you believe you deserve special treatment. Beware of the day that everyone tells you how amazing you are. Okay, you don't have any control over that. If everyone's singing your praises, you can't control that. But I'm just telling you, beware of that day, because that's the day that you will be tempted to believe that you are more than you actually are. And beware of the day that you're too important for your people. Next point, if you want to maximize your moment, is this: your position is for the people. Okay, your position is for the people. Look back at verse 11 and 12. And Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and cedar trees, also carpenters and masons, who built David a house. And David knew that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. Now, watch what's happening here. This is interesting, because there's a king of Tyre. And Tyre is traditionally a powerful city-state, and this king starts just shipping materials to David. He wants to build David a house. Like, that's when you reach a status that is pretty incredible, when people are offering to build you houses. None of y'all have offered to build me a house yet. It's highly offensive. But that's the status David has. People are building homes for him. And when David sees that happening, like, it just affirms, like, God is elevating him and God is empowering him. Like, the wind of God is at his back, and David knows it. But did you see, there's that word "for" again. It's a connecting word. It's telling us why God is empowering and elevating David. It says right there at the end of verse 12, for the sake of the people of Israel. God was supporting David, getting behind him for the sake of his people. Let me just connect some dots for you. Like, if you sometimes struggle reading the Old Testament, let me just tell you the point of the Old Testament, okay? Here's what God's plan was for Israel. God wanted a specific group of people living in a specific place to accomplish a specific purpose. So God brought a specific people, the nation of Israel, into a specific place, the land of Canaan, to accomplish a specific purpose. What was that purpose? It was to put on display the goodness and the glory of God to the surrounding nations. The goal for Israel was to live in intimacy with God, in dependence upon God, and by doing that, their lives and their nation would showcase the beauty and the goodness and the kindness of God. We know that Israel failed to do that. That's why Jesus is really the true Israel. He came, he is the person who is cultivating the people of God who now are putting God's glory on display. But that was the point and purpose for Israel. So David, a man after God's own heart, if God's heart is for this people living in this specific place to accomplish this purpose, and David was a man after God's own heart, then David's heart and his position existed to see the people of Israel glorify God. His position existed so that God would be glorified through Israel, and so that Israel, the people of Israel, would be satisfied in fulfilling the purpose for which they were created. See, David's position did not exist for him. It existed for the sake of the people of Israel. And so just listen to me. Don't miss this. God will not elevate you for you. God won't elevate you for you. Like the greatest beneficiary of your leadership should never be you. But let me just ask you like a very clarifying question. Like this is good for you to evaluate when you're in a position of leadership. Are you leading your people or are you using your people? And the reason that I bring that up is, let me just unpack for you. This is what I've experienced as I've sought to lead. Here's the tendency, okay? The tendency is for you to find your identity in your activity and productivity. Let me say that again. The tendency is going to be to find your identity in your activity and productivity. What I'm actually saying there is you begin to believe that who you are is what you do and how well you do it. So if you think about that, your value now hinges upon how well you lead and how successful the organization is that you lead, how productive it is, how successful it is. So, if now your value is attached to your leadership and the success of what you're leading, well, then the people that you lead are now just a means to your end. You have no choice but to use them to be as productive as possible so that you can feel as valuable as possible. That's a very dangerous place to be. So your position is for the people. It's never for you. So ask this question: are people flourishing under my leadership? Last point I want you to know, if you want to maximize your moment, is this: position yourself before God in a way that will shape your position before people. Okay? Position yourself before God in a way that will shape your position before people. Look with me at verse 17. Just follow along. Here's what it says. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, all the Philistines went up to search for David. But David heard of it and went down to the stronghold. Now, the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand?" And the Lord said to David, "Go up, for I will certainly give the Philistines into your hand." And David came to Baal-perazim, and David defeated them there. And he said, "The Lord has broken through my enemies before me like a breaking flood. Therefore, the name of that place is called Baal-perazim." And the Philistines left their idols there, and David and his men carried them away. And the Philistines came up yet again and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And when David inquired of the Lord, he said, "You shall not go up. Go around to their rear and come against them opposite the balsam trees." And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then rouse yourself, for then the Lord has gone out before you to strike down the army of the Philistines. Watch this, verse 25. And David did as the Lord commanded him and struck down the Philistines from Geba to Gezer. Do you see it? David positioned himself before God in a way that shaped his position before men. We see him seek the Lord. Like before he goes to battle, what does he do? He asks God, do you want me to go up against the Philistines? And what does God say? Go up against them. But then the Philistines attack again. It would have been normal for David to just assume, well, we did this before. The Philistines came up and we just went up against them and we crushed them. So I'm just going to assume God wants to do the same thing. What does David do? He asks the Lord again. And he's so connected with the Lord gives him different instructions. He says, hey, don't go up. Actually, go around to the back and then just wait and listen. Because when you hear something, there's going to be this loud, supernatural sound that is just reminding you that this is actually my battle. And it's going to be me going before you and fighting on your behalf. See, this is so important. David shows us this. Let your leadership be a response to God's leadership. Lead by being led. Listen before leading. Good leaders are first good followers. Position yourself before the Lord. See, that's what we're talking about. Like, so much of tonight can feel like just straight law. Like this is just some self-help leadership seminar. This really isn't about putting your trust in what you have, like just be stronger, be better, be a better leader. No, this is about putting your trust in who has you. This is about you realizing that Jesus Christ is the greater David, that he's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And if you know him in a personal way and you're following him, he's ruling and reigning in your life, and he is giving you everything you need to maximize your moment in that position of leadership. And so where do we go from here? Let me just give you 3 application points for this week. Number 1, before you leave tonight, let me just encourage you to sit with the Lord and listen. And that might feel weird for some of you guys. Like, I'm not telling you to wait here till you hear an audible voice of God. I don't think that's going to happen. I'm just talking about sitting and thinking through the spheres of influence God has placed you in, just asking him, okay, God, what do you want to do through me? And then when you get home tonight, like I'm going to push you every week to have an honest conversation with someone that you know loves you and you trust. Like, ask someone this question: how am I making leadership about me? And then every day this week, let me just encourage you to lead right where you are. Like, lead where you are. Wake up and ask this question: how can I help the people in my sphere of influence flourish? And then as I close tonight, I just want to say this. Some of you are here tonight and you do not know Jesus Christ. It feels like tonight has been all about David. But what you need to know, and we've talked about this every week, is David actually points us to Jesus. Jesus is actually the greater David. And by looking at David, we get a glimpse of Jesus. If you're not familiar with the person of Jesus, or if you're a believer and you just need to be reminded of the beauty of Jesus, here's what you need to know. David grew up in obscurity, and Jesus did too. David was surrendered to the will of God. Jesus was too. David endured great suffering on the way to the throne. Jesus did too. David was finally exalted as king, and Jesus was too. Listen to what Paul says about Jesus. Because of his death, burial, and resurrection, he says, therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Here's the difference between David and Jesus. David defeated his enemies. Jesus saved his enemies. You hear that? David defeated his enemies. Jesus saved his enemies. We started tonight, and I told you the story about who I thought I was and who I actually was were at odds. If you don't know Jesus, some of you are thinking that you're just a stranger to Jesus. You don't know him, and he really doesn't know you. But if the scriptures are correct, you're not a stranger to Jesus, you're an enemy to him. And that sounds like a harsh truth, but the love of Jesus is greater. And Jesus Christ left heaven and came to earth to rescue you. The reason that we prize the cross of Christianity is because on that cross, we believe Jesus Christ was being punished so that we wouldn't have to be. Jesus was dying so that we wouldn't have to die. And he died, he was put in a tomb, and on the third day, he walked out of that tomb as a demonstration that his payment for us was sufficient, so that when we put our faith and trust in Jesus Christ, when we invite him into our lives, when we ask him to rescue us and to be our Savior, when we respond to him, he saves us. And we're no longer enemies of him. We are his friends, his family members. We are invited into the family of God. And the God of the universe looks at us and calls us his children. Do you know him? If not, why wait another day? Why wait another day?